Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another amazing Talks at Google event. My name is Cliff Rediker, and I have the privilege of discussing today the new film out called Score, which is a journey through the history of film composing and the interplay between the visual medium and the audio. And we're very thrilled today to be joined by both the director, Schrader, as well as one of the composers featured in the film, Joe Kraemer. So I'd like to invite them both to join me on stage, and we'll have a few questions. All right. Thanks a lot. Thank you. All right. I think you'll have to hit the on button just on the side there, just to make sure that we're live. So I was wondering if you could first tell me a little bit about the film, what the inspirations were, and probably most importantly, since it's a film about music, film composition, how did you score the score?
Yeah, we jumped into this as really fans, somewhat educated fans, but not that educated, and we thought it would be worthwhile to take a plunge into this topic. It's something that kind of amazingly had not been done before as a documentary, and we had several conversations about a lot of this and realized there's an incredible depth. Obviously, it's such a an immersive kind of creative art form in the first place, but it hasn't really been dived into, I guess, before. And so we actually wanted to try to allow some of the great examples of film scores throughout the years, throughout decades, really the last 100 years probably, be the focal point. The thing that we share. We came into this thinking we probably don't need an original score. At the end, we realized we kind of did. We needed something to kind of at least fill a few different areas where it made a lot of sense, especially where we're explaining something that needs something to kind of carry that just a little bit. But I think that's largely it. We wanted the focal point of this to really be the work over the last many decades that have made a big impact on not just musicians, not just people in film, but also all of pop culture.
Exactly, and I also want to delve a little bit more into the art form as well. If you approach it as one of the largest employers of orchestras these days, it's definitely in the classical tradition. But at the same time, how did that diverge from pure classical music? You have Handel's Water Music. You have a few big capital letter composers that compose for film, but then seems to have split a little bit, and now it's actually on the way back, where you have Nobuo Uematsu in concert, or Hans Zimmer in an auditorium. So how did that journey happen?
Well, I think what happened is that we saw a decline in attendance in classical orchestra concerts. So city orchestras across America were seeing radical drops in attendance. At the same time, the young concert goers that they were trying to attract were interested in seeing concerts with music from The Legend of Zelda or Final Fantasy. And that's where I first saw it happening, was with video games. And so you'd go to a concert hall and there'd be the audience filled with people dressed as Link. You know what I mean? And they'd be there to hear the score from The Wind Waker performed live with a symphony orchestra. And then at the 20th anniversary of E.T., Williams did the score live to picture. And it was the first time I'd seen it done in a concert ever. And it was a huge success. And it took a while for all the studio's legal departments to make all the arrangements. But that became another thing. And so what we're seeing now, the next step was doing an entire film live to picture. And, the New York Philharmonic is getting ready to do 4 Star Wars movies this fall. The Hollywood Bowl every summer is doing, last summer I think they did E.T. and Harry Potter. They're doing 2 or 3 movies a year. I saw them do 2001 live, which was amazing. John Williams, as the conductor of the Boston Pops, was always incorporating specially adapted suites of his film music into the shows. And you saw once in a while, like Gone with the Wind would be on a program, but they were usually Pops concerts that were divided from the classical thing. And what I would think would be interesting would be that, in a way, they start sneaking a classical piece into one of these concerts that's video game music It wouldn't be, it would be harder to do in a concert where they're showing the film. But if you just had a concert where it was like 2 hours of music from all the Star Wars movies without visual, and then you said we're going to throw some of Mars in, we're going to some of the planets in there from Holst, that could be an interesting way to then reignite kids' interest in the classical composers. I mean, the challenge is that the language of contemporary film music is so radically different from the language of classical music. There's a big gulf between the kind of melodic contrapuntal writing that Beethoven was doing and what you're hearing in Pirates of the Caribbean. It's like Mitchell Lieb says, it's Led Zeppelin with an orchestra, so.
Well, and then also I think it separates the art form as well. Like, composing for a film has inherent constraints by definition. The movie is only so long. You're tying it into certain clips. How do you work within that constraint, expand it, and then, if you're doing like a suite or a rearrangement, like what's your approach when you cut out the visual component?
Well, yeah, I mean, people will always marvel at how much John Williams' music works on its own terms, and it's not to put it down. For me, he's sort of the pinnacle of the art form. He makes specific arrangements for concerts, and they're versions that you don't really ever hear in the movie the way you hear them at Symphony Hall. You know what I mean? It's almost like making a hit single out of a Broadway show where the song is never performed that way in the show, but you've made a single of it for the radio. What was the
like how you work within the constraint itself? Like,
so yeah, I mean,
2 hours.
For me, it's not a constraint. For me, it's a helpful skeleton to hang musical ideas on. So, say for example, in Mission Impossible, there's a sequence where Ethan Hunt, played by Tom, the opening scene where he jumps on the wing of that airplane and then hangs onto it as it takes off. You have these sort of signposts along the way that guide and, for me, inform the structure of what I'm writing. So, we have the studio cards at the very beginning that say Paramount Pictures, Skydance Pictures, et cetera, Bad Robot. And then we have the shot of the field, and then Benji pops up, and then conversation begin, and we're cutting back and forth. And all of those events become markers in my timeline in the computer that I use to write my music. And it becomes sort of a binary process of saying, well, is it fast or slow? Is it brass or strings? Is it light or dark? Is it funny or tense? And before I know it, I go, okay, so I've got to write 12 seconds of funny string, medium tempo music. Go. And then, but when you have a set of criteria that you have to satisfy, as programmers, you would all know that, if you've got to make a little applet that does this specific thing, you've got that. And just the same way that you have APIs built into however you're programming and dialog boxes that are built into the OS, I've got those tricks in music that I know will let me communicate, because what I'm trying to do is communicate to the audience. Essentially, a score is a second language track that you're hearing underneath the dialogue, and it's telling the story and it's informing the audience of connections between characters, of where we are in the world, of how we're supposed to be interpreting what we're seeing on an emotional level. And I'm trying to get at your subconscious using a shorthand that's sort of been developed.
Triggers the emotional reaction. Yeah. And of course, thank you for calling programming an art. We like to think it's an art here too. Mission accomplished.
Don't say that.
But then I was also curious too if you could describe just the general process. When are you approached to score these films? Like, is there auditions or demo reels? Like, how does it go from a germ of an idea to you at the piano to you in the studio?
Ideally, what happens is somebody has heard music that I've done for another film, and they're just so in love with it that they've got to have me score their movie no matter what. And they call me and say, we want you to score this movie. That never happens. What happens is I hear that they're making a movie, and I go, I think I'd like to try to work on that. And either I call them directly or through my agent, we reach out to them and see if they're interested, if they've hired somebody. It's not a business oddly enough, it's not a career that is really driven by the person who's doing it. I can't force a director to hire me to score their movie. You know what I mean? And I don't have the means at my disposal to write and direct and make movies just so I can score them, you know. So I'm sort of at the mercy of the people who are hiring. And in my experience, that's principally directors. You know, studio executives obviously play a part in that. Producers play a part in that. You know, in the case of Mission Impossible, Tom Cruise played a part in that because the franchise is his baby. But ultimately, it was Chris McQuarrie as the director of that film that made the decision. You know what I mean? And similarly, I did the score for Jack Reacher with Chris McQuarrie. Chris loved the score. Tom loved the score. By all accounts, everybody loved the score. When Ed Zwick was approached to direct the sequel, the first thing he told everybody is, I don't want to bring anybody back from the first movie. If I take this job, I want to have a fresh start, which means no new photographer, new editor, new production design, new costume design, new composer. And no matter how much I wanted to do the film and how much maybe even Tom or Skydance or Paramount would have liked me to do the film, it was the director's call.
Interesting. And I think it's also worth pointing out that a lot of this comes under very short notice from, you know, the time you get the call. You know, you're in the studio within a matter of weeks, you're recording it within a matter of weeks. You know, how do you work under those deadlines and, you know, stay creative?
You eat a lot, so there's the dinner, and then when you're not working, you drink a lot. You know, there's a certain element of craftsmanship to it. You know, we all sort of have in our brain maybe the perfect game that we want to create for Chrome. You know, we all have the idea of what would be the perfect Google app for the title page. You know what I mean? And then when we get the call to do it, we're suddenly like, I don't know what to do. I had all these great ideas, and now I suddenly can't think what would be the perfect game for me to define myself as a programmer for the Google title page. You know what I mean? Similarly, with composing, I have all these ideas, and then I get the call, and it's a movie that I never thought I would be asked to work on, or a kind of music. I'm like, how did they hear what I've done and think this is what I'm the guy for this? And what's nice is it frees up your thinking, because, you know, in any creative endeavor, what you're trying to do is get past the censor in your head that's saying that's dumb, that stinks, that's not going to work. You know what I mean? So and I have the like I said, the sort of craftsmanship tricks, or you know, the sparks
Phrases,
to help spark my memory or my creative thinking that I can rely on, like the binary decision: fast, slow, light, dark, you know, happy, sad. There's a whole evil concept lurking beneath the whole film world, which the film doesn't really get into, which is temporary music that's been cut into the film. And oftentimes that can be instructive. It can also be handcuffs, but at its best, it's instructive in helping people talk about something that's hard to talk about, which is music.
And we actually had a question from Dave down in our Los Angeles office to that very same idea, the idea of Temp Tracks. And you know, what do you do when the director says, I really love the temp track, make something like it? Or how do you still, you know, infuse your own voice into something that you didn't necessarily make yourself?
I mean, I don't mean to be monopolizing. So anytime you want to answer, just you nudge me. Yeah. Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I trust the production to have lawyers that can vet what I submit. But there are aspects of music that you can seize upon, because what you're trying to get at is the feeling that the music is creating. There was like a sort of a famous lawsuit in the early 80s against the video game Jawbreaker, which Namco, I think, accused of ripping off Pac-Man. And their argument was essentially, if it feels like you're playing, even if it's not the little yellow guy and it's not Ghost, if it feels like you're playing Pac-Man, aren't you infringing on our copyright? You know, and I can't remember how the thing was solved. What you have to do with music is sort of go, what are the elements that I can emulate without getting sued? So chord changes. You can't copyright chord changes, otherwise every single blues artist would be suing every other single blues artist. You can't copyright rhythm, or else Happy Birthday and the Star Spangled Banner would be suing each other. You know what I mean? Because, you know, like, legend has it Robert Kennedy was so tone deaf that he couldn't tell if it was the national anthem or Happy Birthday unless they were singing the words, you know? You can't copyright what key something is or what tempo it is. So right there, you've got tempo, chord changes, key, and rhythm. Now, obviously, if you did all four of those, you'd be really pushing your luck. But those are four aspects that you can examine in a piece of temp and say, how can I, you know, utilize those in one way or another to create the same feeling?
And you're also interjecting your own expertise as well. You can say, like, you know, this works out okay. Like, here's how I want to plus or expand it. Or
right. Well, and the other thing is thematic writing, which I think helps a lot, because if you have themes for characters, what you're really then doing is arranging those themes in the style of the music in the temp.
Cool. So, Matt, I guess going back to the film as well, you know, you're interviewing, you know, dozens of composers. You have a psychologist that you interviewed as well for the cognitive perspective. How did you wind up, you know, selecting the list? Like, what was it like working with these different folks, and also the sort of the split between film scores and TV scores? Like, was that something intentional?
Yeah, and video games too. I mean, video games have become a huge. I mean, that's a big deal for composers now. And you have to structure it differently. You have to, you know, make something so that it's kind of, the score is kind of maybe collapsible or expandable sometimes, and it fits certain storylines. Yeah, so that's one of the. We made the conscious decision because there's so many other kind of developing things that take a very similar model to what you see in kind of the film score, including television, and they kind of expand on it, or they kind of, you know, collapse a little bit. We thought the film score is the easiest one to really comprehend and to kind of get a sense of how it's, you know, how you develop something and how you can kind of come back to it. There's a certain kind of rhythm and a certain kind of poetry, if it's done right, to the way that the music should work. So that, I think we wanted to narrow in on that kind of specific thing. In terms of the people that we interviewed in the film, the music psychologist that we interviewed is fantastic. She's one of the foremost in her field and has all of these crazy, you know, kind of studies that she's done.
Some of them in the brain that lights up.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's that, but it's also eye tracking things. They've studied how music affects where you look on the screen. And she's done some of these really great tests that aren't in the film, but she told us about how, you know, if you have really scary music, you're looking in the shadows of something. You might miss something else entirely. If you have, you know, happy music, and there's this great example from this film she told us about, but you know, someone rowing a boat across a river or a lake, and the left side of the screen is almost all in shadows. And the way that they studied where people were looking for this is they had some text pop up in the shadow that's like bright red. You're not going to miss it. You know, you'll see it for sure. And when they play the scary music, everyone saw it. They said, "What's that? What's that text there?" But if they play kind of, you know, happy music, someone rowing their boat across the water, you never even look there. You're following a story that kind of matches the feeling that's there too. So it shows a little bit about how things can guide the eye, and we thought that was really fascinating stuff.
Well, and it's also a testament to the craft as it's been developed over so many years. It's, you know, it's giving people an emotional context, like playing with the theme. I mean, it's operatic on screen. So. Yeah,
just the stories that you can feel through the music.
And I also, you know, you also spoke with, you know, the session musicians, the editors, you know, and you know, Joe, you can speak to this for you personally, or more broadly for the other folks that you worked with. Is there a sense of a recurring team? You know, do composers have a choice of which, you know, session musicians to work with? Whether they go to Abbey Road or down in LA, or, you know, how does that work? And does it influence the process?
It definitely influences the process. You know, there's two. I mean, I guess the first way to answer the question is there's two general ways that composers work. They either get like a creative fee, and then the recording and all of that stuff is handled by the studio, or they get what's called a package deal, and generally in a package deal, it's all the composer's responsibility. They're given the music budget and told, come back with the score. You'll find with a lot of package deals, you know, that composers have mixer, orchestrator, musicians, studio, everything where they like to work. In this context, I mean the recording studio where they record it. And then you'll find with a creative fee, it's often dictated by if it's a union film, we need to use a union orchestra. If it was like in the case of Mission Impossible, because it was all done in London, it made the most sense to record the score in London. If it had been done in LA, there may have been union requirements that insisted that we score it in LA. You know what I mean? And then if it's a smaller, independently financed film, you know, they're not going to have the means to afford the union. And, you know, you do get, to a certain degree, you get what you pay for. And when you go with a top-notch union orchestra like LA, you're getting, you know, top-notch performance. And when you have to cut corners on the cost, you're usually making up for that. You know, it's
something's got to give.
Yeah, something's got to give, and then you're going to spend more time mixing and editing the performances to get a usable recording. You know what I mean? It helps to know who you're writing for. Certainly in the case, say, Harry Potter, John Williams has a long-standing relationship with a keyboardist named Randy Kerber, and he's got this crazy thing where the guy's on the celeste going for like 30 seconds, just all over the place. And he sent it to Randy like a month before the recording session and was like, I think you're going to want to practice, you know. But he knew he was writing it for Randy, and, you know, there's a video on YouTube somewhere of Randy going like, I got it. It was just all ink. And I was like, oh, you know, like, there's a lot of notes, you know. So, but he, you know, you wouldn't necessarily take that chance if you didn't know who the keyboardist was that you were writing for. You know what I mean? Certainly on a film where you've got to get it done in a fairly remarkable amount of time. When it's a concert piece and you know that the orchestra will have time to rehearse, you can take more chances. You know what I mean?
And the film also made a big deal about the composer in the studio looking at the recording as it's happening versus the composer, you know, right out there like leading the orchestra along. Mm-hmm. You know, like, do you have any preferences? Like, you know, do folks come into, you know, familiar styles? Does it really have an impact on the output, whether you control more from the studio?
Yeah, well, composers definitely hear it differently in different places. And Joe's an example of someone who gets I mean, I guess I'll let you add to this. There are some composers that want to hear, you know, what is being recorded through everything so that they know what you're getting. They maybe know what they can work with, you know, in all of their, you know, editing and mixing and everything else. But there's also, I mean, Joe gave an example of this in the film, and also John Debney did as well. But there's a feeling among a lot of composers still that they really want to conduct, because you are there with the orchestra and you develop a little bit of a kind of a connection and can influence the way they play certain things and can correct things if they're not necessarily being done to completely the way you want. I'll let you kind of explain this.
That's at the middleman, I guess.
I was just going to say it. If I'm sitting in the booth and I've got Pete Anthony conducting, and I want something changed, I have to tell Pete, who then tells the orchestra, you know, and that can work, and that does work for a lot of people. But personally, I mean, there's two things for me personally. One is just how many chances am I going to get to conduct symphony orchestras? So every chance I get, I'm going to take, you know. And then the second thing is I wrote it, and I know how it's supposed to go. And when they play it and it's not right, I can address that. You know what I mean? And it's not because they don't know. I mean, you know, they're sight reading this stuff. I'm throwing, you know, if you've seen Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, there's a 3-minute sequence with a motorcycle chase. And I wrote that on Saturday at 2 p.m, and we were recording it Sunday morning at 11. And the orchestra was sight reading it. And take one could have gone in the movie. I mean, these guys are top notch. But they're sight reading. So what I'm trying to give them technically is a conductor that a person who didn't write the music, because the conductor then is sight reading too, if they're not the composer. What I'm trying to give them is, this is what's going on. They are looking at 50,000 notes playing. They're hearing a click in their headphones. They're playing along, and then just out of the corner of their eye, they're keeping an eye on me as I'm going like this. And what I want them to get in that split second that they look at me is, if I'm going, then they go, oh, wait, I got to back way off. You know what I mean? It's communicate. It's almost like dance. Like I'm communicating through physical motion where they should be on a sort of emotional VU meter. You know what I mean? And if everybody's sight reading, you're now losing a take, essentially, to that. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And time is money. And you're trying to record. I did a score for a television program last month, and I recorded 2 hours of music in 2 days. I mean, we had to fly. So every 5 minutes I can save by not having to do an extra take. That means in the end I got an extra episode done, essentially. You know?
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice. And I guess also to move on to another part of the process is the creation of the soundtrack. I personally find the remade Thomas Crown Affair one of my all-time favorite movies. I loaded the soundtrack, and there was maybe a hint of the melody, but not a whole lot of what I actually remember hearing on film. You know, how do those decisions get made? You know, what are you influenced by when you're creating the soundtrack versus the movie score? We
encountered this is one joke and answer for sure. I think you talked about it briefly in the scene, but there is a different mix that you have, and we've actually encountered a lot of people as this film has started to be released that say, I love that the end of, whatever, Space Cowboys or whatever, but the soundtrack is completely different. That's not the end of it. That's not the right music. They did something else. They took out this. They took out this. And there is a different way that typically composers will treat a soundtrack as opposed to the film.
Yeah, I mean, the movie has to work as a film. And there are... Douglas Adams, I think, made a great comparison of filmmaking. The guy who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where he said getting a film made in Hollywood is like cooking a steak by having 100 people walk past it and breathe on it. And it is like that. It's slow and it's tedious and you never see any progress, and then suddenly the thing is done. But 100 people have all breathed their stanky breath on it. You know what I mean? And the music is no exception. So the director has what they want for start with the composer. The composer has a vision for the score. The director has how they want the music to be. The picture editor has been working with the director since the beginning. They're going to chime in their 2 cents. In the case of Mission Impossible, Tom Cruise is both producer and star, so he has an opinion. The production company Skydance has an opinion. Paramount has an opinion. Perhaps somebody at Paramount might think, oh, it'd be so great if we could have Sting do a song in this movie. So now suddenly Sting is in the mix. You know what I mean? And nobody's necessarily got a sinister motive, but they're all thinking of ways and what they see and how that could help. So if you have a vision as a composer for a piece of music, film music is not for you. It's very much like if you're a painter, they go, I want that wall blue. And you go, well, I really think it should be, red. I don't care what you think. I want that wall blue. You know what I mean? The scene needs it to be blue. And you have to trust that the director is looking at the whole big picture and understanding, yeah, okay, that is blue for a reason. You know what I mean? So the soundtrack album, which has nothing to necessarily have anything to do with pleasing a director or pleasing producers, it can exist to please the composer. And so I look at the soundtrack CD as an opportunity to show my vision for the score, or as close as I could get to it.
Do you think that reveals something?
Well, in Mission Impossible, I sometimes recorded 2 different versions of a cue. I recorded the one that I liked, and I recorded the one that the director wanted for the film. So, for example, right in the beginning of the film, there's a scene where a character pops up, and I had a little tune that went like bum da ba dum da ba da ba dum da ba dum bum da ba dum, and it drove the director crazy. For whatever reason, he couldn't listen to the dialogue with that tune playing, and what finally satisfied him was to have it go bum ba ba dum dee ba da ba dum ba ba dum bum ba ba dum. So it didn't change notes. which underneath the dialogue, you didn't really, it worked okay. But on CD, I was like, I'd rather have the one that changes notes because it's more interesting when there's no dialogue on top of it. So, you know, a great example too is the movie Alien, where the score in the film is a hodgepodge of rewrites and music cut from other films and classical music. And the CD is actually sort of Jerry Goldsmith's vision for what he thought the score to Alien should be. Now, it can be frustrating as a fan when you see a movie because you just see the movie. You don't know all this other stuff took place, and you're going, I love that music, and then you get the album and it's not there or it's different. And you're like, yeah, you know. And the other thing that's not so much an issue now but used to really be an issue is that you used to have to pay the orchestra twice. Once to use the music in the film, and then if you wanted to put it on CD, you had to pay them again, the same amount. That was called the reuse fee. And one of the reasons that London started becoming an attractive option for American film studios was that they got rid of the reuse fee. So if you recorded a score in London, you could do whatever you wanted with the music when it's done, whereas in America, you could only, you know, so a lot of soundtrack albums, the movie would have 90 minutes of score and they'd put 28 minutes on the CD because that's all they could afford to repay. Wow. Yeah. It's like you'll see like a lot of Perez scores from the 90s. They're like 28 minutes long because that was like the sweet spot where they could afford to pay but still make a profit enough to make more scores.
So then do you write that in like the liner notes or something? Like, you know, this was my vision. Like, you know, how can the casual fan, you know, understand or realize all that's
Well, I would argue there are no casual film music fans, you know. I would argue that
ringtones.
Yeah, I would say if you're a film music fan, you're probably somewhat fastidious about that stuff anyway. You know, and it depends. I mean, like a movie like Titanic, most people probably the reason that had phenomenal sales is not because of the score, no offense to the composer, it's because of the song. You know, like Beauty and the Beast, everybody bought that album really for the songs, not necessarily for Mencken's admittedly great score, you know. So, you know, when you're part of it's very rare that you have a thing like the original Star Wars LP that goes whatever it did, double platinum or whatever. I mean, it was the best-selling soundtrack album until The Bodyguard, I think. And there were no songs. You know what I mean? But that was very rare.
I see. Cool. So we have some time for some audience questions, so feel free to, I guess we have one off the bat. We're short on mics, so tell it to me, I'll repeat it, and we'll go from there. So the question, just to repeat for the folks at home, was about the scores. You know, are they becoming less memorable? Is that a trend? Is that intentional versus, you know, Wizard of Oz or something like that?
How nerdy an answer do you want?
We are a nerdy bunch.
Okay. Steven Spielberg used to make films on Super 8 in his neighborhood in New Jersey and his neighborhood in Arizona. He'd make his version of, you know, Iwo Jima. And it was a bunch of 13-year-old kids in blue jeans and green T-shirts with like a plastic helmet that they got at the Woolworths. And then when he'd show his silent movie, he'd play the record with the orchestral score. And you had to make such a cosmic jump in suspension of disbelief to buy that these kids were fighting on the sands of Iwo Jima that the score, you know, he needed all the help he could get. So having this score play worked for him. And that became a kind of musical scoring for his films that he was comfortable with. What happened is in the 80s with like Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and then the explosion of independent cinema, you had people making movies where these homemade movies were starting to be acceptable on their own terms. Instead of trying to make an assault on Iwo Jima, they were making a movie about five guys hanging out at the diner. And so these films actually could get released. And in order to get released, needed music that could be cleared. So you couldn't just track it with sophisticated film music. You had to find somebody who could write the music for you. And so you found somebody from a rock band, generally, down the street who played keyboards, who could write instrumental music for your film. And they may not have ever thought of being a film composer, you know? They may have just thought, I'm the keyboardist in the bar band. You know what I mean? And they end up scoring a movie by basically writing instrumental songs, not necessarily writing a theme and counterpoint and thinking about orchestration and arranging in the sort of sense that Goldsmith and John Williams and Elmer Bernstein were raised in. You know what I mean? They're coming at it from 3-chord rock. And the epitome of that was Hans Zimmer, who really rock and rolled the film score. And the strings are the rhythm guitar, the horns are the lead singer, and the percussion section is the drummer. And the bottom of the low strings are the bass. And then there's synthesizers and actual literal electric guitars in there too. And in conjunction with that approach from the composing point of view, the filmmakers got their musical voice became this rock and roll vocabulary rather than operatic film music, classic golden age film music vocabulary. So they didn't make films with that sound in mind. Spielberg makes a film, he's thinking of what John Williams is going to bring to it. When Soderbergh makes a film, he's thinking about what Cliff Martinez is going to bring to it. You know what I mean? And they're going to bring two totally different things. So I think in that long-winded answer is the germ of what you're hearing, which is that the approach now is much more about background instrumental music than necessarily about thematic storytelling from a more conservatory educated musician. And I hope I said that without insulting that other approach, because I'm not knocking the other approach. They're just two different approaches. And I think what makes music memorable is a theme. I think first and foremost, it's the theme or the tune, not necessarily, supportive string sustained chords. That's a texture more than a memorable theme. So,
right, so we have cool. All right, so there's 3 questions. We'll go here and then back around. So. Yeah. The cooks in the kitchen and how much input you have when you create a score, prepackaged versus voices.
Christopher McQuarrie, who directed Way of the Gun, Jack Reacher, and Rogue Nation, Mission Impossible. So the 3 biggest movies I've done have been with him. He had some experiences where he was really frustrated on films that he'd written, where the score sounded a lot like the temp. And so he devised as a filmmaker an approach, at least when I worked with him, of no temp at all. He cuts the film based on the performance of the actors and the writing of the dialogue and gives it to me with no music. And what's liberating about that is I can make my own statement. What's daunting about that is there's no guidance whatsoever. And if I start barking up one tree and Chris hates that tree, I've got to come all the way back down and find another tree and start working up that one. So there can be a lot of not wasted energy, but there's a lot of work that is done that never goes anywhere because it was the wrong route. Where a temp can really help is when it gets rid of, when the filmmakers have explored their options and have decided, no, this is the direction we want to go. That can help a lot. So, okay, we know it's going to be orchestral symphonic music. It's not going to be jazz, and it's not going to be rhythmic electric guitar rock music. Okay, well, that helps a lot just to know that. I'm trying to think of a film where we had so many people on it with differing visions. And I'm actually kind of drawing a blank. I mean,
they're probably weeded out before the process had started. People jump on the ship.
The studio heads have stories like that, where even they notice that they've had input from this person, this person, this person, this person. It all ends up being kind of this mishmash of idea, right. Something that maybe you could see some potential, but it never kind of came to fruition because everyone's like, you do that, you do that. Robert Kraft at Fox would tell us how everyone thinks they're an expert in music because we all like music for the most part. So we're all like, oh, well, I would do this. I like this. I would do this. And to a composer, that is sometimes something that kind of, restricts what you can do if someone says, well, I really like this, so that's what we should do.
I think the other mistake is thinking that you have to, either as a composer or a filmmaker, like the music. The job is not to make music that we like necessarily, it's to make music that works. So, you know, I heard an anecdote about one of the Star Wars films that wasn't directed by George Lucas, and somebody who was brought on was like, but I don't really like that John Williams music. And they were like, well, it doesn't matter if you like it or not. It's not about that. That's the kind of music these movies need, whether you like it or not. It's been proven, like, that's the voice of these films. So maybe you don't listen to that for fun, and maybe you don't enjoy that, but that's irrelevant. You know, if you're making an action film but you don't like to drive fast, that doesn't mean you make everybody drive slow. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Cool. And so we had some other questions. We'll do the back and front. So go you, yeah.
It's very similar, yeah.
And just to rephrase the question, the idea of remixes, composers imitating themselves, taking extracts from one film, putting it in another. We had some other examples listed.
Well, as a composer, and then we have a voice. You know, I have a way of saying things. When David Mamet writes a script and he writes another script, or Sorkin, you know, there's a voice behind that. Do you know what I mean? And there are certain gestures, you might say, or musical ideas that are going to recur. To give maximum benefit of the doubt to the filmmaker, to the composers in the situations you mentioned, I would say that they were probably heavily encouraged by the filmmakers to stick as close to a piece of temp music as they could. And sometimes it's easier when it's your own stuff, and sometimes it's harder, actually, because you can't see the forest for the trees. You know what I mean? Now, I'm going to show some ignorance here. The Max Richter stuff was written as concert music, wasn't it? And then tracked into the films. That's right. So that's slightly different, because I think it's also in Shutter Island, right? You know? But I think it's like Arvo Part. Like, it was written for the concert hall, I believe. I could be totally wrong. Right. So I mean, like, you'll see, like, you know, Habanera from Carmen is in every dun 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 dun. Dun. You'll hear that in It Was in Scent of a Woman, but it's in everything. You know what I mean? Where they take a piece of classical music that they love and they use it in a film, and then somebody sees that and loves that and goes, "Oh, that's classical music. I could just use that. Great." You know. And then you'll see cases where the composer was encouraged to copy the temp and they just couldn't do it, so they've gone and bought the temp. So like in the movie Die Hard, when the blonde bad guy jumps up at the end of the movie, you think he's dead, and he jumps up with the gun and starts going nuts. They just bought the music from Aliens that they had temped in, because for whatever reason, the director and the composer could not come up with a solution together.
And actually, there is on the topic of voice, you know, because we entered this film with the idea of, like, okay, I know what a Hans Zimmer score sounds like. I know what, you know, there's a certain number of people I can almost always, I should say, identify John Williams. I can, a lot of the times, identify Danny Elfman. I can usually identify Thomas Newman. A lot of these guys have a very kind of a signature style. If they're given, you know, that you can do anything in the world for this film, it's still going to sound like them. And we tried to tap into that a couple times, including at Han. We kind of wanted to know what Han sounded like, and so we thought about this with a few composers. Some composers struggled with it, but we asked them to just play something and didn't give them any direction really, but kind of wanted to see where they went. And a few of them, you know, usually on a piano, but a few of them, including Hans, you can tell, and it's in the end of our movie, but you can tell from kind of the chords that he picks. It sounds very Hans Zimmer. It's a lot of long, kind of sustained chords. But even the direction that he goes in kind of making something up for, this is something for nothing. It's just some people with cameras pointed at him. It's never going to air anywhere. But it sounds like the progression that he would use in a movie. So you can kind of, you can almost identify even that, something that's 30 seconds long. Oh yeah, that sounds like Hans Zimmer. So I think a lot of composers do have that unique voice that you can pick up on, even if, you know, sometimes it's directly used in another film, but even if it's not.
And speaking of unique voice too, like if you look at the Mission Possible suite, like how do you approach composing each one? Like there's the core theme from the TV show that kind of has to be there, but do you feel forced to make something sound completely different, or like a sibling relationship between the films, or
Well, to speak specifically about Mission, it drives me nuts when you go to one of these reboots or sequels and they've gotten a different composer from who did the original, and they try to put the music from the original in, and it usually ends up sounding like they've literally just gone and gotten the sheet music from the first movie and handed it to all the musicians and said, just play this, as opposed to actually sort of organically integrating that into this new score. And so with Mission, it was really important to me. It didn't necessarily help my career, but it was really important to me that you couldn't necessarily tell where Lalo ended and I began. Because I didn't want it to be like, oh, it's Joe Kraemer, Joe Kraemer, Joe Kraemer, Lalo Schifrin, brilliant, Joe Kraemer, Joe Kraemer, Joe Kraemer, Joe Kraemer, So I worked really hard when Lalo would come in and out, you know what I mean? So, I embarked on a sort of reverse engineering of the theme and breaking it down into its core pieces and then using those core pieces kind of like, refrigerator magnet poetry to create new music for the film. And as a result, my hope was that what you would get is, it's the same words, but I'm making new sentences with those words.
And like for the documentary King Cohen that you're working on too,
Mm-hmm.
it's an historical perspective. It's things that appeared on screen, so it suggests something already. Since it's a documentary medium, do you just feel compelled to like go with the flow, or how would you strike out in your own?
That was a movie to the gentleman who had been asking about Too Many Cooks. It wasn't necessarily that we had too many cooks, but there were two interesting things on that film. One was that the filmmakers were big film music fans, and so they were very excited to like finally get a chance to actually help participate in the creation of a score. And I kept having to tell them, like, guys, this film, we're not necessarily going to be making music you actually like. I just wanted to warn them, And in a documentary, music can often be just practical. What we're doing is we're cutting in and out of a movie, and we have a scene from a movie, then we have a talking head, and then we have another scene from the movie, then a talking head, and then another scene from the movie. And it sounds weird to have the score because a lot of these movies were done so long ago and so cheaply that we don't have the original elements anymore. We've only got the finished movie. So there was no way to get the dialogue without the score. You know what I mean? It was all or nothing. So what I had to do is compose little bits of music that could go under the talking head to glue the whole thing together so that you'd come out of a clip from the movie. I'd have the music in a sympathetic chord and a similar sound, play under the dialogue, and then come back for the next clip. And sometimes they liked that and sometimes they didn't. And then, I actually haven't seen the finished film, so I don't know how they ended up doing it, because I gave them a couple of choices. But yeah, it was a practical thing there of just trying to make stuff glue together. There was another film I worked on where they had a thing from SNL, and they could get the clip of it was for a Ralph Nader documentary. They could get a clip of him talking, but they couldn't use any of the music. So when they came back from commercial with the screen and it's the bluesy sax stuff, I had to make all that and then figure out a way to get out of that and into the dialogue from Nader. So it's practical.
All right, so I think we have two final questions. So we'll go with Bob Purvey, the president of the Mountain View Film Society, first. True or not? Did Hitchcock hate this?
I haven't heard that he hated it, but I do know that he was, really happy with like what. And Hitchcock's a great example of what I talk about. In modern film, this, the auteur has sort of run rampant. And now everybody on a film is there to realize the director's vision. And what I'm supposed to do is write music that the director would write if he could write music. And what Hitchcock did was he was like, I'm not even going to try to write music. Bernard Herrmann knows what he's doing. Let him write music. And even if it's not what I'm expecting or what I want, when I hear it, oh, yeah, that's great. I never, So I do think that he was impressed with that. I do know they had a falling out. So... But I can't say for sure that he hated the shower scene until he saw it. I do know that Joe Stefano, I think it is, who wrote the book, they had a screening of the rough cut before the score was done, and Stefano, after the screening, was like, oh my God, it's terrible. And Hitchcock was like, no, wait, this is the rough cut. When you see it with the music and the sound, it'll be a different movie. So.
All right, so our last question in the back. Yeah, how do you, what's your workflow?
I work on Sonar on a PC. I'm the only composer I know who does that. But I learned it when I was young, and I just, old dog, can't, I could learn Logic, I could learn my music editor is constantly on me to learn Cubase, and maybe I will. But for now, I fly on it because I have all my hotkeys programmed and all that stuff. So what I do is I watch the film. We have what's called a spotting session where we discuss where we think music will be and where it should go and where it'll be quiet and what the music will kind of be. Will it be a sad score? Is it a sad movie where we want a happier score to help offset that? Or is it a comedy where we want the music to actually be like, again, this latest project is a comedy. It's a sort of satire on cop shows from the 80s. So I did everything acoustically, like a late 70s, like Rockford Files or such, SWAT. And the music is very straight. If you hear the music away from the film, much like the score to Airplane, if you hear that score away from the film, it sounds like it's for a disaster movie, not for a comedy. So we'll have that discussion. Then I live with the film. I watch the film as much as possible. Sometimes with the temp, more often without the temp, and just start to learn the rhythm of the film and pick up on connections. Something a character says here that pays off there. You know what I mean? And I start thinking about, I have a whole series of sort of mnemonics that I go through in my brain to help me start coming up with ideas. So if it's a heroic character, the theme is probably going to be kind of uplifting, and it's going to have intervals in it of leaps. If it's a sad movie, then it's obviously, if it's a laconic sort of dour theme that might be almost like a waltz, but a sad minor key waltz. You know what I mean? And I develop this material, and I keep a journal on the piano where I write all this stuff down. And then usually when they're so mad at me that I haven't shown them anything to picture yet, I then finally start working to picture. And what I've got is like a cheat sheet of all this thematic notation that I've done. And I start throwing stuff up against it and seeing what sticks. And then I start making the cues. And at that point, I've got my timeline where I go, okay, I've got to do 15 seconds of contemplative music, and then he makes the decision. So then it becomes 20 seconds of definitive music as he marches down the hall to talk to his boss. And then he goes in the boss's office, and the boss is, running around with the secretary. So it's funny music for a few seconds. You know what I mean? So at that point, and I'm doing all this stuff in Sonar. Once I have a template set up that mimics a symphony orchestra or whatever ensemble I'm using for this particular assignment. And then I create a mock-up that sounds as real as I could make it sound in a reasonable amount of time. And I then do as much of that as I can for as much of the movie as I can. And then I have the director come over, and we just watch it. From beginning to end, like a movie, with as little interruption as possible. Then we roll back and start going through measure by measure, scene by scene, however it needs to be done, to discuss what works for the director and what doesn't work. Now, what I found recently is helping a lot is to actually just kind of email it to them, have their editors put it in the film, and let them live with it for a week before we talk about it. Because often what happens is the first thing they think is, it's not the temp. It's not the temp, and now everything I hate about the scene, I hate again because the temp fixed it all, and this isn't fixing it all. And it's not that. It's that they're just seeing all the flaws because that's what they made this thing, and they can see all the cracks in the paint. John Lennon hated Sgt. Pepper, but he was the only one. You know what I mean? Because he could see behind the curtain. So what I find is if I let them live with it for a week, then a lot of that panic that they got goes away, and they actually start looking at it on its own terms and saying, no, all right, I see why you did that. I see why and we couldn't do that with the temp because no one else had done that before, and we couldn't find a piece of temp that turned that way. There's a back and forth of revision. When the cue is locked up, I'm sorry this is so long-winded, that is sent to the orchestrator as a MIDI file. They open it up in Sibelius or Finale, and they then adapt my MIDI performances into notation, which is then printed out and distributed to the musicians at the session. And that can happen, like in the case of the motorcycle chase of Mission Impossible, that had to happen in less than 12 hours. So
the orchestrator doesn't sleep, not very much.
But they know that. They get paid for that.
Awesome stuff. Well, I invite you all to check out the documentary. We'll have it up on Google Play, wherever movies are shown. And of course, now I hope you have an even deeper appreciation for the music and the themes behind the score of the film. So, Matt, Joe, thank you very much for speaking with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.